As you may have heard, there have been a series of rallies in major Australian cities today under the banner of March for Australia. There's evidence that many of the organisers of these marches are people with a proven history of engagement with ultranationalist and white supremacist ideologies and groups. But actually, for most of us, those connections are not that important. The advertised agenda of the rallies speaks for itself. They're calling for an end to mass immigration in the name of taking our country back, defending our heritage, and defending our culture. And although it's since been removed from their advertising, initially they were calling for remigration, that is, sending migrants back to their countries of origin. This sort of thing is not new. Australia has a long history of racism and being inhospitable to migrants and refugees. Not only were there genocidal policies towards Indigenous Australians, but there was an official white Australia policy for most of the 20th century that was specifically designed to limit non-British migration to Australia. But since the final dismantling of the White Australia policy in the 1970s and the Fraser government's groundbreaking welcoming of Vietnamese refugees, it's felt like we've been progressively becoming more inclusive and hospitable. But all that progress is feeling under threat again, isn't it? We're hearing more and more reports of white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups gaining members and gaining influence. Intimidating marches by groups of angry young men in balaclavas and dressed in black take place in cities and regional centres, and the impact of one of their gatherings is still tearing apart the Victorian Liberal Party, with a leader lost and members suing each other. I'm not sure whether the neo-Nazis appeared as an identifiable group in today's marches. I haven't heard, although I did see that Thomas Sewell, who's certainly one of them, addressed the Melbourne rally. But there's no doubt that the agendas are closely related. And then there's the usual counter-protest to these kind of marches, which once again resulted in violent brawls in Melbourne today. The so-called anti-fascist groups that usually turn up to protest against these kind of anti-immigration protest marches often seem to me to be almost as scary as what they're protesting against. Both sides often seem equally eager to use violence against the other, and you sure don't want to get caught in the middle. How did we get here? And what sort of response might it call forth from those of us who are seeking to be followers of the way of Jesus? One of the biggest factors in how we got here is fear. The March for Australia organisers would probably say, yes, fear of losing our country, losing our heritage, losing our culture. But I think that's a very superficial reading of it. Because what we've seen over and over through history is that when people start trying to aggressively assert the rights of an us over against the rights of an alien them, what generally underlies it is a bigger fear that all kinds of things are getting frightening and that we have little or no control over them and that someone must be to blame. Actually, I think it would be fair to make the same observation about the rise of sovereign citizen groups and other conspiracy theorists. The more life seems to be going badly and the more powerless we feel to do anything about it, the more susceptible we become to simplistic theories that offer an explanation and someone to blame. So for the March for Australia crowd, it's blame the migrants. For the sovereign citizen crowd, it's blame the police, the legal system, and the government. Maybe even the anti-fascist counter-protesters dealing with the same fear by blaming racists. Thinking that we know who to blame gives us a feeling of taking back some control, of being able to do something. And yet, for the rest of us who haven't gone down these rabbit holes, witnessing angry protesters facing off against angry counter protesters in our streets, or seeing the shocking reports from Paul of the murderous extremes that some of these sovereign citizen types can go to, are precisely the kind of things that are making our world feel so unsafe. Sometimes the much bigger threats like war and climate crisis can feel far enough away to push them out of our consciousness. But these things are in our neighborhoods and confront us with a feeling that civil society is breaking down and that the basic agreements about mutual respect and trusting our social institutions are falling apart and turning us against one another. The prophet Jeremiah also lived in times of social breakdown and the looming threat of national disaster. In the passage we heard tonight, he attributes this to the nation abandoning God's ways and adopting worthless and ruinous alternatives. The picture he describes is more complex than the overly simplistic commentary you sometimes hear today from Christians who just say, "We've abandoned God's ways, we've abandoned God's ways." Jeremiah uses this metaphor with two parts. God is like a fountain of living water, which the people have given up drinking from, and instead, determined to make their own way and do things for themselves, they've dug their own water holes, which are completely substandard, constantly leaking and holding nothing but sludge. The problem is not just what they've abandoned, but what they've latched onto instead. I wonder if that's just as true of our world today, or perhaps this country. It's too easy to point to plummeting rates of church attendance and Christian beliefs and say that's the problem, but it's never the whole problem. The question is not so much what we've stopped believing in, but what have we started believing in instead? When we decided to do things for ourselves, what did we switch our allegiance to? What are we putting our trust in now to provide us with life and meaning and identity and social cohesion? And how's that going? Of course, as society fragments into competing tribal identities, there's no one new thing that everyone has adopted as their chosen waterhole. For those who took to the streets in the March for Australia today, it's an aggressive monocultural Australianness, a kind of ethno-nationalist vision of Australia for the white man. And I say man deliberately because it almost always seems to go hand in hand with a nostalgia for a bygone patriarchal era. How do we, as followers of Jesus, respond to all this? I think our readings from the letter to the Hebrews and from Luke's Gospel give us some helpful pointers, but I want to introduce them with a concept that comes from my friend Bishop Melkaz at the Baptist Church in Tbilisi, Georgia, where I preached 3 weeks ago. Melkaz speaks of what he calls a theology of beauty, and he describes it as a stance that says, whenever we come across ugliness, we respond to the ugliness with a project of beauty. And his number one example of this approach is quite closely related to our question of how to respond to things like the anti-immigration march for Australia today. Melkaz says that in Georgia, when we saw the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, we saw that we had to respond to it with a project of beauty. And this is how the Peace Project came into being. Now, the Peace Project is what they've done of creating a mosque, a synagogue, and a church all under the one roof in partnership with one another. I learned a lot during my time with the Baptists in Georgia, but I think this concept of responding to ugliness with a project of beauty is probably the thing that's going to most occupy my imagination for some time to come. Because you see, it's so wonderfully different from seeing the ugliness of the anti-immigration marches today and just responding by protesting against their protest and perhaps risking becoming an equally ugly counter-protest. Instead of protesting against the ugly protest, Malkas would challenge us to search for a project we could undertake that creates a witness to a beautiful alternative. In truth, this is what churches are supposed to be: creative, beautiful alternatives to the fragmentation, hostility, and despair we see around us. And of course, we have no monopoly on this. There are other examples of beautiful alternatives too, many of them not Christian. And whenever we see beautiful alternatives, there we see partners with whom we can share and learn and build beauty together. Which brings me to the guidance offered in tonight's reading from the letter to the Hebrews, starting as it does with, "Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers." Like quite a few of the New Testament letters, the letter to the Hebrews has spent much of its time unpacking some solid theology before turning right at the end to some practical application. And this is the start of the practical application. Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. Our world has a fair bit in common with the world into which this letter was written. The dominant empire is spiraling into decadence, division, and political chaos, and hostile empires amassing on the borders waiting their chance. People are increasingly afraid of what is coming and, in a desire to find someone to blame, are protesting against minority races, minority religions, anyone they might safely point the finger at. And in the face of that, the writer says, let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. That would be the same strangers that others are pointing the finger at and gathering angry mobs in the streets to oppose. Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. It's not a call to get out and protest against the angry protesters. It's a call to create a sign of beauty, a sign of hospitality in action. When you bay for their blood in the streets, we will not draw attention to your angry protest, but we will set about offering beautiful hospitality to the strangers you want to reject. And the writer continues, remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them, those who are being tortured as though you yourselves were being tortured. The reference to torture should perhaps alert us to the need to think of this more widely than just those who have been legally sentenced to serve time for their crimes. Because the use of torture is usually associated with contexts of war or oppression. It happens when there is a desire to crush an idea or an identity or a culture. So the writer of the letter is calling us to recognize that where torture is being used, it could just as easily be us whose faith or identity was being targeted, and to pray accordingly for those who are currently the victims. Tomorrow it might be us needing their prayers of solidarity. And let marriage be held in honor by all, the writer continues, and let the marriage bed be kept undefiled. Now, it'd be easy to hear this as a random insertion of some old-fashioned conservative sexual moralism, because that's how it's so often preached, but I think that would be a mistake. Rather, I think in this context that it is a recognition that when society is descending into chaos and division, our most intimate relationships come under pressure too. Part of that pressure is that committed intimate relationships are treated with less and less respect, and sexual betrayal is almost normalized. In such a climate, we have to work even harder to make healthy, intimate relationships work well. And the writer of the letter is urging us to do that. Slide into chaos here, and you'll be contributing to the slide into chaos everywhere. But don't just protest angrily against perceived immoralities. Instead, set about creating beautiful communities in which one another's relationships are treated with respect and honor and enabled to flourish. Before I finish, I want to glance too at something Jesus said in tonight's gospel reading. He suggested that when holding a banquet, we might intentionally invite those who are usually the least likely to be invited. Now, most of us are seldom banquet holders, so if taken too literally, this might not seem very relevant to us. But there's no need to think about it only in relation to banquets. It can connect straight back to this thing of showing hospitality to strangers. Who are the least likely to be welcomed into our communities, our circles of friends, our group gatherings? There have been people in the streets today urging that certain people not be welcomed into our country. In what ways might we respond to that by modeling the opposite, going out of our way to welcome and befriend those very people? I'm not here with a bunch of ready-made answers to these questions or with any concrete proposal for some project of beauty that we can embark on. I've only been home for a couple of weeks, and these ideas are still unpacking themselves in my head. More importantly, finding our answers, our projects, is a task for all of us together, not something that I should be driving. I might be introducing some of the questions, but we have to find the answers together. What I can say for sure, though, is that finding ways of doing good in the midst of whatever is going on in our world is every bit as important as what we're doing here in worship and is very closely tied to it. Our reading from the letter to the Hebrews finished by urging us to worship, continually offering a sacrifice of praise to God, and then immediately saying, do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. Worship and putting love and care into action. Such offerings are pleasing to God.